With the rising demand for electric vehicles, EVs, worldwide, there's also a steady rise and an impressive competition between the US and China, both manufacturers and great powers. While automakers like Tesla and China's BYD company compete for sales revenue and market share, the US and China compete for influence and energy independence. So the question is, which of these nations is in the fast lane when it comes to EV production? Stay tuned as we give you a front row seat in this competitive race. And be sure to give us a like and hit the subscribe button and enable notifications if you haven't already. Okay, let's begin by looking at what the United States has under its hood. We all know that American tailpipes have played a massive part in global warming. In 2019, transportation accounted for 29% of the country's human-generated emissions, the most of any sector tracked by the Environmental Protection Agency. And in addition to that, the U.S. is the world's second-largest carbon emitter. Therefore, the Biden administration aims to clean up transportation's dirty reputation and make America the global leader in electric vehicle production in the process. Even though most dominant tech companies reside in the United States, in the auto sector, most U.S. companies are still selling the old internal combustion engine technology. Fortunately, Tesla is changing things, and Detroit automakers are starting to introduce electric cars. In the U.S., Tesla and General Motors accounted for about half of the 358,000 EVs sold in 2018. However, U.S. car buyers haven't accelerated their adoption of electric cars anywhere near what's currently happening in China. Currently, electric vehicles, or EVs for short, aren't prevalent in the U.S. Only about 2% of vehicles sold in the U.S. last year were electric. U.S. manufacturers have made enormous strides in recent years, but more investment is needed to improve battery technology and increase demand. U.S. policymakers have taken notice and recognize that to compete with China, they must step up investments. To harness renewable energy sources for EVs, developments in battery storage capacity are crucial. 6 U.S. government agencies spent a combined $1.3 billion between 2009 and 2012 on projects and initiatives to develop more efficient batteries, and that number has grown since. Battery innovation is also a focus of technological innovation among EV manufacturers. Tesla recently spent hundreds of millions of dollars acquiring a battery developer that hopes to increase the longevity of EV batteries. For EVs to cost less than internal combustion engine vehicles, the cost per kilowatt hour needs to be below $150. In 2010, the price per kilowatt hour of EV batteries was $1,000. Today, Tesla's Model 3 cost $190 per kilowatt hour. Some studies predict that with proper investment in technology, the cost of EV batteries could drop to as little as $73 per kilowatt hour by 2030. However, the development of EV batteries by U.S. manufacturers comes with a catch. China produces almost 2/3 of the world's lithium-ion batteries and controls the global supply chain. Tesla is the only U.S. EV manufacturer that produces any significant number of its EV batteries. Without the ability to produce more EV batteries, the U.S. may lag behind China in EV production. U.S. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer has proposed tax credits for consumers seeking to trade in gasoline-powered vehicles for EVs. Additionally, his proposal includes grants to states to develop EV charging infrastructure and manufacturers to improve battery technology. House Democrats also introduced legislation seeking to extend or expand tax credits for plug-in EVs and encourage states to update building codes to integrate EV charging stations. Joe Biden has identified the growth of the electric vehicle market as a key plank in his administration's efforts to cut U.S. emissions to net zero by 2050, with the U.S. president framing the issue as a boon to American manufacturing and jobs. The Biden administration's $2.65 trillion infrastructure plan allocates $174 billion for developing America's EV industry and calls for the installation of 500,000 publicly accessible charging ports, introducing point-of-sale rebates for consumers, and electrification of the federal fleet, the 650,000 vehicles owned by the U.S. government. But Biden's ambitions comes with challenges. For one, he's called for the electric fleet replacement to be made and sourced by union workers right here in America. But as of now, there are no EVs that can fit that demand. There are signs, however, that this could change soon. For example, General Motors, which has expressed interest in federal contracts, announced earlier this year that it would stop making gas-powered light-duty vehicles by 2035 and will introduce 30 new electric vehicle models over the next 5 years. And to produce those EVs, the company wants to bring its supply chain stateside. The president's infrastructure package likely faces a long political path forward. But it clearly and unapologetically signals that electric vehicles are a federal policy priority and that it can have substantial implications for America's automotive industry, positioned to emerge from an emissions-choked past into a battery-powered future. Now, let's look at what keeps China ahead of its competition. In China, more and more new car buyers are opting for an electric car. This speaks to the rapid development of the country's electric vehicle industry. The production and sales of electric cars in China is equivalent to half of the global market. In September of 2020, sales of electric cars sold in China grew 67% year-on-year. Despite being affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, many Chinese electric vehicle manufacturers increased their production and sales figures. Investors were also pleased with last year's performance. In November, the share price of NIO, an electric vehicle startup, was close to $50, and the company's market value was over $60 billion. This means the young company is outperforming many internationally established automakers. The global electric vehicle market is growing exponentially, increasing sixfold since 2013 and doubling since 2015. Much of that growth is being driven by China. China has invested at least $60 billion to support the EV industry, and it's pushing an ambitious plan to transition to all electric. China has by far the largest market for EVs, and China's state-owned manufacturers collectively are the highest volume producers of EVs. For much of the last decade, China was largely unopposed in its position as the global leader in EVs. However, changing consumer demands have begun to shift this dynamic in favor of Western manufacturers, and Tesla in particular. While the US has invested heavily in technological innovation, China has invested in EV infrastructure. The Chinese government has been installing thousands of charging stations per month for years now, and China's public EV charging infrastructure currently dwarfs that of the US. Projections suggest that more than 1 in 3 Chinese cars will be EVs by 2030. In contrast, less than 1 in 7 vehicles in the US will be EVs by 2030. China's infrastructure investment will pay dividends in terms of energy security and reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. Recently, China imposed a mandate on auto manufacturers requiring electric vehicles to make up 40% of all sales by 2030. And this move will probably expand the production of EVs and EV batteries enough to lower the worldwide cost of both. Within China, yearly sales of all vehicles will drop temporarily and then resume growing. The market share of EVs will expand as authorized, but many models will remain more expensive than their gasoline-powered counterparts. In recent decades, China's rapid economic growth has enabled more and more consumers to buy cars. The result has been improved mobility and the largest automotive market globally, but also severe urban air pollution, high greenhouse gas emissions, and growing dependence on oil imports. To counteract those troubling trends, the Chinese government has imposed policies to encourage the adoption of plug-in electric vehicles. Since buying an EV costs more than buying a conventional internal combustion engine vehicle in 2009, the government began to provide generous subsidies for EV purchases, but the price differential and the number of buyers were both significant, so paying for the subsidies became highly costly to the government. As a result, China's policymakers phased out the subsidies by the end of 2020 and instead depended on a mandate imposed on car manufacturers. Simply stated, the mandate requires that a certain percent of all vehicles sold by a manufacturer each year must be battery-powered. To avoid financial penalties every year, manufacturers must earn a stipulated number of points awarded for each EV produced based on a complex formula that considers range, energy efficiency, performance, and more. The requirements get more challenging over time, intending to have EVs make up 40% of all car sales by 2030. So what did you think? Will these countries manage to meet their set targets in time? And in the long run, do you think the USA will manage to catch up with China or even outdo it in the EV race? Let me know in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you next time on the channel.